A flight attendant disrespected a black man traveling with his family, but he had no idea the man was closely connected to the president, and the situation quickly flipped. A flight attendant brutally beat a black man holding his baby. Convinced no one would ever question him, he didn't realize the man was traveling with the president himself. The moment that blow landed, the entire cabin crossed a line that could never be undone. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true power walks in. The boarding line jolted as Dr. Marlon Varrin was shoved sideways, subtly but unmistakably, by the flight attendant brushing past him without a glance. "Use the correct lane," the man muttered under his breath, eyes glued to the tablet in his hand, not even pausing to confirm the passenger's name or class. Marlon steadied himself, one arm securing the soft carrier pressed to his chest, where his 6-month-old son, Leron, slept soundly. The sudden jostle hadn't woken the child, but it had stirred something else. Marlon's eyes narrowed. He said nothing, just moved forward with quiet resolve, fingers brushing down the blanket to ensure Leron was still warm. The boarding area for Aerius Flight 917 was far more tense than any Marlon had passed through before. He'd spent years in high-security briefings, defense labs, and strategic crisis units. He recognized the signs, the low-toned whispers between crew members, the unusually stiff posture of the attendants, the glances that darted quickly away whenever someone passed the front row. Someone important was expected today, but they clearly didn't think it was him. Marlon kept his head down, stepping past the curtain into the forward economy cabin, his polished shoes muffled against the dark carpet. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't look like a key holder. He looked like a father, tired, composed, carrying a baby and a worn carry-on. But under the seat in his other hand was a slim, hardened briefcase. Encrypted, internally tracked, and containing a prototype system called Shield Line, an emergency override framework designed to protect national assets during any cyber or kinetic threat. Only one person in the world held full knowledge of its structure, and that person was currently adjusting a pacifier between his child's cheeks, pretending not to notice the second flight attendant glancing over his shoulder and whispering to another. Seat 3A. Marlon found it without help. The bulkhead wall provided a bit of extra space, a small gift for a man with a baby in tow. He settled Leron gently, propping a rolled blanket beneath his elbow for support. The infant shifted, murmured, then settled again. Marlon's breath caught for a second, not from fatigue, but from focus. Every move was intentional, measured. He wasn't here to draw attention. Just reach Valden City, brief the president, return home. But his instincts were humming. Faint turbulence rumbled beneath the plane as it powered up for taxi. That wasn't what concerned him. It was the flight attendant, the one who had shoved him at the gate. He was back. Closer now. Name tag. Farron Doss. He walked the aisle with too much ownership, too much force. Marlon saw the way passengers flinched subtly when Farron passed, the way he smiled only with his mouth, the way his eyes scanned with judgment, not service. Leron stirred and let out a soft, gurgled cry. Farron's head snapped toward them like a whip. "Sir, please keep him quiet," Farron said, tone clipped. Marlon blinked. "We haven't even taken off." "It's still disruptive." Marlon adjusted his arm slightly, rocking Leron gently. "He's just waking up. I'll manage." Farron gave him a look, not of concern but disapproval. Then he turned without reply. Across the aisle, a young male crew member, shorter, anxious eyes, watched the exchange. He didn't intervene, but he didn't look away either. Marlon caught it. A glance, then another. The same quiet exchange between two crew members that had played out several times since boarding. He pressed his back into the seat, felt the edge of the encrypted case with his shoe. Still there, locked, stable. That case, more than anything else on this plane, carried value that no one here could imagine, and yet they only saw a black man with a baby, in economy. The whispers at the front of the plane resumed. A door hissed shut, faint beeping from the cockpit. Overhead bins clicked as someone checked the locks. Marlon glanced toward the window. Gray light bled over the tarmac, still early. Too early for this much tension. He had flown under aliases before. He had traveled with federal clearance invisibly, slipping through spaces unnoticed as instructed. But something about this flight felt wrong. Not broken, yet, but leaning toward something brittle. He reached into his blazer and checked the wristband beneath his sleeve, matte black, coated with a low-frequency emitter. Not visible to most, but critical to federal tracking if anything went wrong. Just a precaution, they had told him. Varrin passed again, this time slower. His eyes darted toward Marlon's wrist, then narrowed. "You're not entitled to early priority treatment in this section," he said coldly. Marlon raised an eyebrow. "I didn't request any. Just making it clear." He kept walking. Leron murmured again, this time louder. Marlon leaned close, whispering, "Shh, it's okay. Almost there, little one." Another glance from across the aisle. The younger crew member again. Hesitant, concerned, as if he knew something was off, but didn't know what to do about it. Varrin's back was turned, but Marlon had been in enough high-risk rooms to recognize posturing. Varrin's stance wasn't just authoritative, it was anticipatory. As if he'd already decided there would be a problem, as if he wanted one. Seatbelts clicked around the cabin. Overhead, the safety lights flickered on. Marlon tightened the strap across his lap, his hand cradling the back of Leron's head. His eyes dropped once more to the encrypted case at his feet. He couldn't afford a disruption. He couldn't afford visibility. And yet, the first tremor of the plane, not from wheels or engine but from tension, had already begun. He had no idea that the flight would test every part of his strength. Varrin Doss reappeared in the aisle just as Marlon clicked the seatbelt across Leron's sleeping form, the soft hiss of the buckle nearly masked by the hum of passengers settling. Without so much as a greeting, Varrin pointed toward the overhead bin with his tablet. "You'll need to store that carrier up top," he said flatly. Marlon didn't even look up at first, focusing instead on gently adjusting Leron's blanket. "That would violate FAA regulations," he replied calmly, voice low, respectful. "Infant carriers with integrated harnesses are permitted in lap seating, provided they're secured." Varrin's eyes narrowed. "We have our own procedures." Marlon looked up now, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. "Then your procedures conflict with federal code. I've flown dozens of times with this same setup." The surrounding passengers were already beginning to glance over, sensing the tension. The cabin hadn't even left the ground, but something about the tone was off, abrasive, uneven, unprovoked. Leron stirred slightly in Marlon's arms, his tiny brow furrowing in sleep. "Passengers shouldn't be creating disturbances before takeoff," Varrin muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. His voice carried the performative righteousness of someone who wanted an audience. Marlon remained still. "My son is asleep. I'm not disturbing anyone." "You're being difficult," Varrin snapped, stepping closer. At that moment, the sharp beep of a closing overhead bin broke the silence, followed by the calm, almost hesitant voice of another flight attendant. "Varrin," Jorlin Hask said quietly from behind him, "you might want to leave that one alone." Varrin turned, scowling. "Excuse me?" Jorlin hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Marlon, then to the infant in his arms, and back. "Just maybe focus on the pre-checks," he said, trying to stay neutral. Varrin scoffed and shook his head. "You've been soft lately, Jorlin." He turned back toward Marlon, and his gaze dropped to Marlon's left wrist. A thin, black band rested just above the cuff of his blazer, the kind used for discreet government identification, a detail that would be meaningless to most, but not to someone trained to recognize protocol cues. But Varrin wasn't trained. He squinted at the band and sneered. "VIP wristband doesn't count in economy. You're not entitled to special treatment here." Marlon didn't reply. He simply shifted Leron slightly, resting the baby's head against his chest, and leaned back into the seat. Calm, focused, deliberate. Then Leron stirred again and let out a soft cry. Brief, instinctive, but enough for nearby heads to swivel. Varrin saw his chance. "This is exactly the issue," he declared loudly. "You're already drawing attention. This section is supposed to remain quiet during boarding." Before Marlon could respond, Varrin leaned in. "We're moving you." Marlon blinked. "Excuse me?" "Back of the plane, internal reassignment. You'll be more comfortable there," Varrin said, not as a courtesy but a verdict. "I'm not changing seats. There's no reason to," Marlon replied, still composed but firm. "And I haven't been reassigned." Varrin folded his arms. "It's not a request." Jorlin took a step forward, the shift in his body subtle but clear. "Varrin," he warned again, more forcefully this time. "There's no reassignment order. He's assigned to 3A. Varrin didn't even look at him. His focus remained on Marlon, as though Jorlin hadn't spoken at all. Then, slowly, Varrin reached out and grabbed Marlon's forearm. The moment was quiet, but charged like a wire. Marlon didn't move. His free hand instinctively tightened around Leron. Passengers nearby froze. The energy in the cabin now shifted into a hush that bordered on dread. Marlon's voice, when it came, was soft. "Please remove your hand." Varrin's grip lingered a moment too long before he let go, exhaling through his nose. He gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes, then turned to Jorlin and whispered something unintelligible. Jorlin's brow furrowed as he caught part of the sentence. It wasn't a warning. It was a calculation. Varrin wasn't backing down. He was preparing for something. And in that moment, the soft cry of Leron faded again, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like pressure in the chest. Marlon stayed still, protective instincts on high alert, his thoughts already running scenarios. The calm of the plane, the fragile artificial piece of boarding, was gone. That was the moment the plane's calm began to break apart like thin glass. Varrin Doss stormed down the aisle with such force that the carpeted floor beneath him seemed to recoil. The plane had barely leveled off from takeoff when he arrived at row 3, towering over Dr. Marlon Varrin, who sat with his infant son nestled against his chest. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly for the ascent, but Varrin's sharp tone cut through the hush like a blade. "Let me see your ticket," he barked, holding out his palm like a demand rather than a request. Marlon looked up, calm but wary. He shifted Leron gently against his shoulder, his voice measured. "We've already gone through this. I'm seated in 3A. "That's not what I asked," Varrin snapped, his breath hot with impatience. "Your destination, your reason for travel, why you brought a baby on a long-haul flight knowing it would disturb other passengers." Marlon's brows lowered subtly. "I'm not required to explain that," he replied, keeping his tone even but firm. "We're cleared to fly." The passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One man in 3C slowly adjusted his earbuds, pretending not to listen while clearly doing so. A middle-aged gentleman in 4D peered around his seat, sensing something unnatural in the exchange. Tension was mounting. Just then, as if summoned by the stress in the air, Leron began to cry, a sharp, startled sound caused by the pressure shift. The baby twisted in discomfort, and Marlon instinctively pulled him closer, whispering gently, rocking his small frame with care. Varrin's face twisted in visible irritation. "Control the noise," he barked. "We're not running a daycare in the sky." Marlon didn't respond immediately. He was focused on soothing his son, shielding him from the rising aggression. But Varrin wasn't finished. He stepped forward, leaning in with a rigid jaw and clenched teeth. "I said—" "Step back," Marlon said firmly, voice lowered but crystal clear. Instead, Varrin reached forward without warning and tried to pry the infant from Marlon's arms. "If you can't handle him, I will. We need quiet in the cabin." The motion was sudden and reckless. Marlon reacted instantly, shifting his body to shield Leron, one hand cradling the child, the other blocking Varrin's approach. "You're not touching my son," he said coldly. Their arms collided. It wasn't a punch, it wasn't loud, but the impact was like thunder in the silent aisle. A few gasps broke out. Seatbelt lights still glowed above as passengers watched the scene unfold. Frozen. From the rear of the cabin, Jorlin Hask hurried forward. "Varrin," he said, voice cautious. "That's enough. Let me take over." "Stay out of it," Varrin snarled without turning. His eyes stayed locked on Marlon like a predator challenged. The insult wasn't just in the words, but in the complete dismissal of Jorlin's authority. The reader, by now, knows the truth. Marlon Varrin wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a tired passenger. At that very moment, in the echoing halls of Valden City Terminal, armored SUVs and motorcades were being aligned. The presidential convoy was forming. The nation's commander-in-chief was expecting the arrival of this very man, carrying the shield line protocol that only he could explain. But here, at 30,000 feet, Marlon was treated like a nuisance, a problem, a passenger to be handled. Varrin's ignorance wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. Varrin leaned forward and shoved Marlon backward into the armrest. The motion was sharp, deliberate. The metal edge of the seat hit Marlon's back, and Leron's head tapped lightly against his collarbone. The baby cried harder, shrill with discomfort and fear. Marlon winced and immediately checked his son. "You just endangered a child," he warned tightly. "That's a violation of," Varrin laughed, loud and bitter. "Now you're threatening crew? You want to play that game? You think your little wristband gives you authority?" Several passengers began filming, phones angled just slightly over the armrests. One teenager in 2D whispered to his father, who quietly turned on his camera. The cabin air felt electric, like something irreversible had just started. Marlon shifted upright again, cradling Leron with both arms, protective and composed despite the rising storm. He had been in military briefings, tech disasters, and corporate security breaches, but never this. Never with his son in the line of fire. "You're escalating a situation you don't understand," he said. His voice was low now, with steel underneath. Varrin narrowed his eyes, stepped back an inch, and muttered, just loud enough for Marlon to hear. "Some people need to learn their place." There it was, the crack in the mask. The truth. Not about airline rules, not about safety. This was personal, or worse, systemic. Marlon stared at him, calm as ever. But inside, something clicked. This wasn't a mistake or overreaction. It was targeted. It had intent. Marlon now understood that this was no misunderstanding. This was a storm aimed directly at him. The turbulence jolted the cabin with a low, guttural shudder that made a few overhead bins rattle slightly, but it wasn't the shaking that startled the passengers. It was the sudden, violent sound of a shoulder being grabbed. Varrin Doss lunged toward row 3 with purposeful aggression, bypassing protocol, ignoring seatbelt signs, and moving as though the whole plane belonged to him. "You've been disrupting protocol since you boarded," he snapped, reaching for Dr. Marlon Varrin's shoulder and yanking upward without warning. Marlon instinctively hunched forward, shielding Leron against his chest. "Please don't touch me," he said evenly, voice low but firm, protecting the infant cocooned in his arms. His grip on the baby carrier tightened, muscles reacting from years of physical discipline, not with violence, but restraint. But Varrin wasn't listening. He gritted his teeth and shoved Marlon's side, jerking him back toward the aisle. "You're coming with me now." Marlon staggered but held on to Leron with both arms. The baby let out a startled, sharp cry, and the sound cut through the cabin like torn fabric. Heads turned. One man removed his earbuds. A teenage boy in row 5 stopped chewing mid-bite. But no one intervened yet. Not yet. "What are you doing?" Marlon asked, still trying to de-escalate, his eyes darting down to make sure Leron's head was secure. "You've been resisting instruction since boarding. You've been warned. Let's go." Varrin's voice was loud now, performative, defensive, as if trying to convince the plane that something dangerous was unfolding. Then, with a sudden, brutal motion, Varrin slammed Marlon against the bulkhead wall just beside Seat 3A. The cabin gasped audibly. Marlon's shoulders struck first, and his knee buckled slightly, but his grip on Leron never loosened. The child cried louder, a desperate, primal sound of fear and confusion. "Stop!" someone in row 2 shouted. "Hey, he has a baby!" But Varrin ignored them. His authority felt absolute, an illusion he'd repeated so many times that he'd come to believe it. His hand shot out again, this time grabbing Marlon's right wrist and twisting it backward at an unnatural angle. The encrypted case under Marlon's seat tumbled loose and slid halfway into the aisle. Varrin noticed the case, but didn't care. With a careless kick, he shoved it away toward the opposite row, unaware that inside it rested the only operational biometric access key to Shield Line, a classified national defense safeguard. Marlon's heart pounded not from the pain, but from the risk. If the device's core destabilized, it could lose containment. "Don't touch that case," he said through gritted teeth, but Varrin was already turning back to him. Leron's cries now filled the aircraft, high-pitched and relentless, echoing in the air with unbearable tension. Sweat formed on Marlon's brow, but his focus never wavered from the child in his arms. Every muscle in his body formed a barrier around his son, shielding him like armor. "I warned you," Varrin growled. Then came the strike. With the back of his hand, Varrin slapped Marlon across the face, hard, unrestrained, and loud. The sound reverberated like a whip crack through the cabin. The plane might as well have gone silent. Even the baby's cry paused for a moment before resuming, trembling with renewed fear. Marlon didn't fall. He didn't retaliate. His head turned with the impact, glasses askew, jaw stiffened, but he held his ground. He pulled Leron tighter, resting his cheek against the top of the child's head, as if drawing strength from the tiny, terrified boy who knew nothing of national secrets, only that he needed his father to be strong. "I'm not resisting," Marlon said slowly, breathing with difficulty now. "I'm protecting my son." From the galley, Yorlin Hask appeared, but stopped short when Varrin shouted without looking, "Out of this, Yorlin!" "Now!" Yorlin's lips parted in protest, but fear and years of hierarchy kept him frozen. His eyes flicked between the case, Marlon's wristband, and the stunned passengers. In row 4C, Corin Thale, a middle-aged man in a gray sports coat, quietly tapped his screen. His camera had been recording since the moment the shouting began. He didn't know who Marlon was, but he knew that this scene, was wrong, and it needed to be seen. From a seat near the back, another passenger did the same. Without knowing it, one of them had just pressed send. In the cockpit, a soft alert tone pinged on the first officer's console. A flagged message had arrived, anonymous but urgent. "Attack underway in row 3. Passenger with infant being assaulted. Footage attached." Captain Ren Doric glanced at the screen, reading the details. His hand hovered over the overhead mic switch, but instead he tapped a private crew override. "Run cabin crew conduct protocol. Flag crew member DOS. Do not engage." He didn't know yet who Marlon was, but he knew they had a problem in the aisle. Back in row 3, Varrin stared at Marlon like he was an enemy combatant. His face had flushed red from exertion and ego. Around them, passengers now whispered, recorded, and murmured. But no one moved. The cabin had turned into a theater of fear. Marlon's mind was working despite the pain, assessing the next move, calculating the best way to protect Leron and recover the case without escalating things further. But his wrist throbbed, and the sting from the slap burned across his cheek like heat from a live wire. Then, for the first time, Varrin looked around and saw something shift. Dozens of eyes, some angry, some stunned, some terrified, were locked on him, not on Marlon, and one man was standing, Corin Thale. "I have this all recorded," Corin said calmly but loudly enough to carry. "If you don't stop, you'll be explaining it to federal prosecutors." Varrin blinked, suddenly unsure, but the damage had already been done. The case was across the aisle. The encrypted access key inside was potentially compromised. The baby was crying. The father was bruised. And the camera was rolling. The moment Varrin's hand struck Marlon, the entire fate of the flight changed direction. The moment Varrin's hand left Marlon's face, the cabin dropped into silence like a theater losing its sound. Marlon didn't move. His body remained hunched protectively over his infant son, Leron, whose small cries trembled through the hush like cracked glass. A faint pink welt was rising across Marlon's cheek, but his eyes, sharp, unblinking, were focused only on his son, who whimpered against his chest. The seatbelt light above still glowed amber, but nothing else in the plane seemed to matter. Varrin didn't retreat. His chest heaved with adrenaline, and his posture tightened like a spring. "This man is endangering the aircraft," he barked loudly, gesturing to Marlon with an accusing finger. "He's refusing lawful instructions and—" He turned to the aisle, scanning for backup. "I need assistance now." But no one moved. Jorlin Hask, standing a few rows away, stared at Varrin with disbelief, his arms slack at his sides. After a tense pause, he shook his head slowly. "You've crossed a line," Jorlin said under his breath, backing away. The distance he placed between himself and Varrin was not just physical, it was moral. Varrin didn't seem to notice. His voice cracked louder as he tried to regain control. "This passenger is non-compliant. He's resisting directives. I'm authorized to—" "You're not authorized to lay hands on a civilian," came a voice from seat 4C. Corin Thale, a gray-haired man in a crisp blazer, stood up slowly. His eyes were fixed on Varrin, but his phone was already raised, recording. "I'm a former federal attorney. Touch him again, and you'll answer for it under federal assault statutes." Varrin hesitated, but just barely. His fingers twitched as if calculating the consequences, but then he lunged anyway, not at Marlon, but at the black, hard-shell case under the seat. With a sharp yank, he pulled it free. Marlon's voice rang out, low but cutting. "I advise you to place that case down immediately." Varrin turned and laughed bitterly. "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Get in line." The cabin murmured nervously, a ripple of unease passing through rows of passengers who could sense something wasn't right, but still didn't fully grasp what was at stake. Marlon's hands remained steady, one gripping the back of the seat in front of him, the other cradling Leron's tiny head. But on his left wrist, a subtle red blink began to flash. The faint light went unnoticed by most, but not all. 2,000 miles away, in a soundproof surveillance room deep within Valden Terminal's central security wing, the blinking wristband triggered an alert on a dormant screen. The operator on duty sat up straighter as the tag auto-registered Level 7. Distress code. Physical trauma detected. Passenger MV classified. Aerius 917. Within 30 seconds, the terminal's presidential liaison was alerted. In another 30, a red phone in the Situation Room rang. When an aide whispered the update to President Auric Delvin mid-briefing, the nation's leader rose from his chair without hesitation. Back in the aircraft cabin, Varrin pressed the latch on the case and flipped it open. Inside was an unmarked black cylinder, smooth and featureless, cradled in a custom biometric recess. No display, no brand, no user panel, just the eerie, silent presence of something engineered to remain hidden. Varrin stared at it, unimpressed. This is what you're protecting." He reached in, grabbed the cylinder, and turned it in his palm. "Looks like a flashlight." "Don't touch it," Marlon said, now standing slowly, his knees weak but his tone unwavering. "It's not for you." Varrin scoffed, made a theatrical show of inspecting it, then tossed the cylinder back into the case as if discarding a toy. The object rolled and locked automatically back into place with a soft, internal click, but the damage had been done, not to the device, but to the chain of security surrounding it. Corrin stepped forward another pace. "You've just tampered with federal property," he warned, voice tightening. "This footage is being broadcast. You are no longer dealing with passengers, you're dealing with witnesses." Varrin's hands were trembling now. Whether from fear, rage, or the loss of control, no one could tell. His gaze darted across the cabin, seeking reinforcement that wasn't coming. Several passengers were filming. A few whispered to one another, eyes wide. One boy clutched his father's arm tightly. The calm of the plane had shattered. Leron let out a quiet sob, and Marlon instinctively rocked him. The red light on his wristband blinked again, more urgent now. And then the plane's intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice came through, measured, firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an onboard incident, we have initiated a precautionary review. We ask that all passengers remain seated. Crew members, stand by for command override." Varrin's eyes widened. "What is this?" he whispered almost to himself. But no answer came from Marlon. Only a look, calm, bruised, but unbreakable. Across the control centers, a sequence of override codes had already been entered. The route of Flight 917 was being altered in real time, but none of that was visible to Varrin. Not yet. Back in the aisle, Marlon bent to close the case carefully. As the latch clicked shut, his voice came again, soft, but sharper than steel. The man who thought he was punishing a father had just endangered a nation's last defense plan. Varrin's forearm jammed into Marlon's throat with the force of a man desperate to prove dominance. The back of Marlon's head knocked against the metal galley wall. His breath caught in his chest as he hunched to shield his crying son. Leron's muffled wails were smothered against Marlon's shirt, the child too young to know what terror was, yet caught in the heart of it. Varrin growled through clenched teeth. "You're done disrupting this flight. You're finished." His voice was unhinged, eyes bloodshot, his grip fueled by something far deeper than procedure. But above them, in the sealed cockpit, Captain Ren Doric stared wide-eyed at a flashing message on his secure comms screen. "Protect passenger M. Varrin. Stand down, crew if non-compliant." "Lock the service doors," Doric ordered quietly, his voice firm. "Now." The co-pilot obeyed without question. Whatever was happening behind them was now a matter of federal urgency. Back in the cabin, passengers had begun standing, stunned by the brutal scene unfolding in front of them. Corrin Theo, still holding his phone, now had a trembling edge in his voice as he muttered into the live stream, "He's choking him. He's actually choking him while holding the baby." Marlon's thoughts narrowed to a single instinct. Protect Leron. He twisted his body enough to wedge the baby between the wall and his chest, even as Varrin's weight crushed down on him. The pain in his neck and shoulders screamed, but he didn't cry out. Years of strategic discipline and trauma training told him, stay calm. Responding emotionally now would only escalate everything. Then, as Varrin shoved harder, Leron's blanket slipped down, revealing the soft blue onesie and, clipped just above the waistline, a glowing silver tag with a tiny etched symbol, the three-tiered triangle of Level 9 federal clearance. Yorlin Hask, who had hesitated too long, finally gasped when he saw it. "Wait," he muttered, eyes locked on the tag. He took one step closer, saw it again, and froze. That symbol wasn't decorative. It wasn't a toy. It was embedded in only one class of biometric identifier, issued for government-protected dependents. He stumbled backward and turned, sprinting toward the cockpit. Varrin didn't notice. His hands shook with fury. "Still think you're above the rules?" he hissed, jabbing Marlon's chest with his knuckles. "Still think you get to talk back because you," Marlon with a hoarse whisper cut through the madness, "you have no idea what you've just done." The words hung in the air, cold, final. From the front of the plane, a high-pitched beep echoed through the cabin speakers as the flight suddenly dipped, not drastically, but deliberately. A new course correction. The captain's voice followed. "This is your captain speaking. We are diverting immediately to Leron Field Base under federal directive. Please remain seated. This is a security protocol." Gasps rose across the cabin. Someone near the back said, "Leron Field? That's a military base." Varrin staggered slightly, his balance thrown by the shift in altitude and the growing whispers around him. He turned back toward the cockpit. "What is this?" he shouted. "What's going on?" Marlon used the moment to reposition Leron, drawing in breath through a bruised windpipe. He looked around, making eye contact with a few passengers, men who now stared not in judgment, but in quiet recognition. They were seeing him. Finally. Corin stepped closer, his voice firmer now. "You assaulted a federal asset. That child is tagged, and you're being broadcast right now to more than a dozen legal feeds." He held up the phone. "It's too late to stop this." Varrin, sweating, backed away 2 steps. His eyes darted toward the overhead bins, toward the exits, toward anywhere he might regain control. But the aircraft itself was already obeying a different master now, guiding them down, gradually but unstoppably, toward the base where ground units were assembling. Far below, inside Valden Terminal's secure control room, rows of security screens displayed real-time footage from the stream. One officer pointed at the biometric flare from Marlon's wristband. Another officer picked up the red phone. "Confirmed. That's M. Varrin. He's alive, but under assault. The child's tag was exposed." "Status?" asked the security lead. "Flight 917 is descending. Emergency reroute already in progress." The commander on site turned to his team and gave one clipped command. "Mobilize intercept on tarmac. Bring the President's security advance, now." Back inside the plane, Marlon didn't flinch as Varrin began pacing like a cornered animal. His body ached. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from restraint. Leron's breathing slowed as he calmed in his father's arms. And somewhere between the altitude lost and the truth exposed, the entire plane shifted its understanding. The man in Seat 3A was not just a father, not just a passenger, not just a statistic. He was a man carrying the future, and now every eye in the cabin began to see it. With every foot of altitude lost, Varrin's career and the secret he just shattered. The overhead lights flickered as the aircraft jolted slightly, the kind of turbulence that felt less like weather and more like judgment. Then a static crackle rang through the intercom. The captain's voice followed, calm but clipped with urgency. "This is Captain Darick. We are declaring an in-flight emergency due to crew misconduct. Per federal override protocol, we are diverting immediately to Leron Field Base." Gasps spread through the cabin like a chain reaction. Passengers looked around in confusion, some gripping their armrests, others checking their phones. Varrin Doss, still near the galley, whipped his head toward the ceiling speaker like he'd been struck. His hand trembled as he slammed the intercom button. "What do you mean misconduct?" he barked. "Captain, this is a miscommunication. I had to restrain a disruptive passenger." The reply never came. Jorlin Hask stepped out from his jump seat, walking slowly toward Varrin with his hands raised, not in surrender, but certainty. His voice was even, but firm enough to silence the background noise. "You assaulted a man carrying a presidential asset," he said, locking eyes with Varrin. "This isn't going away." Varrin froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. His eyes darted toward Marlon Varrin, who now sat upright in seat 3A, blood trickling faintly from a cut along his temple. His shirt was torn at the collar, glasses cracked, and yet his hands held steady as he rocked his baby son, Leron, who whimpered against his chest. Marlon's breath was shallow, but his posture was unshaken. Slowly, he pressed his thumb against the chip embedded in his watch. A faint click followed as a signal pulsed from his wrist, connecting with the scattered biometric case across the aisle. A soft blue glow blinked twice from the case, then red. Locked. Varrin caught the glow and stepped forward. "You can't," he began. Marlon didn't look up. His voice was hoarse but commanding. "You've already done enough." Varrin spun back to the passengers, searching for backup. "He's faking credentials. He threatened me. You all saw. He refused instructions. He put that child in danger." "No," Corinthale interrupted, standing now in row 4 with his phone still recording. "We all saw you lose control. We saw you strike him, and we're still seeing it." The stream was live. Screens around the country were beginning to pick it up, the cabin's yellowed lighting and raw violence being replayed second by second. Someone, somewhere, was already typing the headline. In a steel-clad command room 3 states away, President Auric Delvin leaned forward as the footage streamed onto a secured monitor. The sound was muted, but the image of Marlon, bruised, holding his infant son while a crew member screamed at him, was enough. Delvin looked to his aide. "Have my team on that runway," he said. "No delays." Back on the aircraft, the shift was undeniable. The power had flipped, and the weight of what Varrin had done pressed against him like cabin pressure collapsing in reverse. Still, he wasn't done lying. "This is a setup," he muttered. "He played all of you. He staged this." Yorlin turned. "He didn't stage your fists." Varrin's voice dropped. "You're backing him, after everything?" "I'm backing the truth." Meanwhile, Marlon quietly adjusted Leron's carrier against his body. The child's breathing had slowed, but the smallest whimper escaped with every bump in descent. Marlon kissed the boy's head and whispered words no one could hear. His hands moved deliberately, checking the strap, securing the headrest, and realigning the encrypted watch interface near his palm. Across the aisle, an older boy in seat 6F, no older than 11, stood halfway up in his seat and raised his hand slowly in salute. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Passengers began to murmur softly, their support no longer hidden. A nod from 2D, a whispered "thank you" from 5B. Even the flight marshal seated incognito in 7C, who had remained silent throughout the incident, now stood quietly near the bulkhead, watching Varrin with restrained judgment. But Marlon remained detached from the growing support. He wasn't doing this for applause. He wasn't here to win sympathy. His focus was on survival, for his son, and for the mission he carried. The real battle wasn't just about what happened, it was about what nearly happened. He reached for Leron's small fingers, laced them into his own, and whispered, "We're almost there, son." And as the landing gear locked into place with a heavy, echoing thud, the entire plane felt the shift, power returning to where it always should have been. The man, once shoved for holding a crying child, was now being awaited by the leader of a nation. The attendant smirked, thinking the father was alone and helpless, unaware that every strike he delivered was being watched, recorded, and relayed to the highest level of authority in the country. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when discipline meets national power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The plane jolted as its wheels kissed the tarmac of Larenfield Base, the impact jarring the silence that had filled the cabin. Engines whined into deceleration. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber, and a static-laced announcement clicked on overhead. Captain Ren Darrick's voice, firm and calm, cut through the unease. "Passengers, remain seated. Federal intervention in progress." The weight of those words sank into every row like a stone dropped into water. Eyes darted, phones froze mid-record, breaths were held. Then chaos flickered. In the rear galley, Farron Doss, pale, sweating, and wide-eyed, suddenly lunged toward the aft exit. His hands scrambled for the door controls, but they wouldn't budge. Locked. Sealed. Electrically overridden from the cockpit minutes earlier. The reinforced mechanisms hissed in resistance as Farron pounded his fist against the unyielding panel. "Let me out, this is a setup," he shouted, voice cracking, his usual bravado now laced with panic. He lied about everything." From the aisle, Yorlin Hask stepped into his path with quiet determination. He wasn't trembling, just still. "You're not going anywhere," he said evenly. His stance was not confrontational, just absolute. Varrin paused. For the first time, he seemed to realize how alone he was. In the front of the aircraft, 2 black-suited federal agents boarded briskly, not wasting a second. Their movements were sharp, practiced. One approached Varrin with handcuffs already in his grasp. "Mr. Doss, stand down," the taller agent ordered. Varrin's defiance wavered, flickering behind panicked eyes. "You can't arrest me. I was doing my job." "That's not what the footage says," the agent replied flatly. They stepped forward. Varrin didn't resist, not really. He sagged as they secured the cuffs, his voice dropping to a bitter whisper. As he was escorted past row 3, his narrowed eyes locked onto Marlon Varrin, now being gently lifted by 2 federal aides from his seat. "You tricked us," Varrin spat, the words slithering like venom between clenched teeth. Marlon, battered but upright, adjusted Leron in his arms and looked at Varrin with a calm far more devastating than rage. "You exposed yourself," he replied, voice steady, soft, and final. A hush fell over the aircraft. The tension that had once screamed in silence was now replaced by something heavier. Realization. Leron, cradled close to Marlon's chest, stirred once, and then settled. For the first time in hours, the baby fell asleep. Outside, the runway glinted beneath the sunless sky. Flanked on both sides were armored SUVs, flashing unmarked lights. Medical vans stood at ready, engines humming low like a waiting heartbeat. Dozens of black-clad agents lined the perimeter in strategic formation, eyes trained on the aircraft like sentinels guarding a national secret. Captain Doric remained at the cockpit threshold, watching the scene unfold with solemn awareness of the stakes. His co-pilot stood beside him, silent, holding a small data tablet that displayed the presidential directive received mid-flight. Then, movement at the base of the air stair. The president of the United Federation, Auric Delvin, stood there. No podium, no motorcade, no press. Just his sharp navy coat, silver collar pin, and the gravity of a man used to storms. His presence didn't need words. Marlon, bruised and limping, stepped down the aircraft stairwell, Leron secure in his arms. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he didn't pause. As his polished shoes touched the tarmac, the world seemed to still. Delvin stepped forward. Their eyes met, and without pomp or pretense, the 2 men exchanged a handshake, quiet, firm, reverent. Nothing more was needed. Marlon was immediately ushered into a secure black vehicle waiting nearby. Inside, a medical team prepped quietly, one examining Marlon's wrist, another gently checking Leron's heartbeat as the child continued to sleep soundly. Outside, another federal agent approached the sealed SUV containing the recovered encrypted case. He placed it inside a titanium lockbox and entered a biometric code to seal it again, the system confirming full data integrity. On the runway, President Delvin turned toward his security chief, a broad-shouldered man with a worn comms device in hand. "I want a full review of that airline's personnel files," the president said, voice low but commanding. "Every one of them." His security chief nodded once, already dialing into a secure channel. Back aboard the plane, the passengers remained seated, frozen between awe, guilt, and awakening. What had begun as a routine flight was now something entirely different. A line had been crossed, a system exposed, and a legacy quietly ignited beneath the roar of turbines and silence of power. What was once a routine flight had just become the spark for aviation reform at the highest level. The footage had already passed 4 million views by the time the first national headline appeared: Shield Line Assault, Passenger Brutalized on Flight 917. By then, the damage was already done. The moment Corin Thale's livestream cut to the part where Farron Doss struck Marlon Varrin across the face while he held his baby, America's collective conscience caught fire. The internet exploded. Clips of the assault flooded every platform, dissected by news anchors, legal experts, and enraged citizens alike. Yet amidst the outrage, one question echoed louder than the rest. Who was this man they attacked? Inside a sterile federal facility not far from Leron Field Base, Marlon Varrin sat in a medical evaluation room, his suit torn at the collar, lip bruised, wrist swollen. His hand never left Leron's small back. The baby finally slept, but his shallow breaths trembled. Marlon looked down at his son, chest tightening, not from the pain of the injuries, but from the terrifying realization of how close they'd come to disaster. Behind a nearby glass partition, 2 federal agents observed silently as doctors scanned Marlon's arm and rewrapped it. The encrypted case, returned to his side moments ago, now blinked slowly as the embedded biometric chip confirmed. Contents intact, undisturbed. Shield Line's final protocol had survived, but barely. Marlon exhaled. If he'd opened it one more layer, he whispered, voice low. The attending agent stepped in. Dr. Varrin, we've secured the contents. The access key's biometric lock engaged successfully. It was never breached. Marlon nodded faintly, but his eyes remained haunted. The code inside would have triggered fail sweep, a memory purge on every node. He closed the lid slowly, almost like closing a casket. We wouldn't just lose access. The president would have no defense line left. While Marlon's thoughts raced through what-ifs and unspoken fears, the world outside turned ferocious. Commentators on every major network debated the incident with breathless intensity. Some framed it as unchecked racism. Others blamed airline negligence or a failure of authority protocol. But only federal investigators knew the full classified truth that Farron's assault hadn't just endangered a man. It had nearly fractured the nation's last cybersecurity wall. At Aerius Flight Services headquarters, chaos reigned. Executives gathered in an emergency session, voices raised, hands trembling over half-read legal briefings. One board member slammed his fist on the table. "We had warnings about this crew member," he shouted. "There were 3 internal reports against him. 3. Another hissed, "They'll crucify us. The president's already on TV." Indeed, he was. On national airwaves, standing at a dark podium beneath the crest of the federal command, President Auric Delvan's voice was calm, but thunderous. "A protected federal asset was assaulted in our skies," he said, eyes unwavering into the camera. "This is not just a scandal. It's a national security failure." Then came the defense inquiry. Farron Doss, now under federal custody, sat on the far end of the chamber, guarded by 2 plainclothes officers. His attorney rose to read a statement. "Mr. Doss wishes to express remorse. He believes he misjudged the situation." But before he could finish, another man rose from the witness bench. Jorlin Hask, the second crew member from the flight. His voice was crisp. "No, that's not the truth." All eyes shifted. "I flew with Farron on 9 flights. I warned supervisors twice. He had a pattern, targeting certain passengers, escalating minor issues into conflict. We were told to stay silent. Management said he was firm but fair. He wasn't. He was dangerous. And this time, it wasn't just misconduct. It was an assault." The courtroom rippled with murmurs. Dorn called for silence, but the weight of Jorlin's words had already landed. Marlon didn't blink. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed showed how wide the failure was. The hearing turned. What had begun as a testimony session became something more, a reckoning for every time someone like Marlon was dismissed, doubted, or disrespected in a uniformed space they had paid to enter. Then came the moment no one expected. A federal aide approached the counsel table and passed over a sealed envelope. Dorn opened it and scanned its contents. "This," he said, lifting the paper, is a signed directive from President Auric Delvin. It formally requests the creation of a National Review Board for Airline Misconduct, a civilian-led body. It is to be called the Leron Initiative. The room fell completely silent again. "And he has asked that it be chaired," Dorn continued, turning toward Marlon, "by Dr. Marlon Varrin." A beat passed, then two. Marlon said nothing for a moment. Even Leron stirred quietly in his seat, as if sensing history reconfiguring itself. Slowly, Marlon nodded once, not with pride, but with clarity. "I accept." And with that, the arc that began with a man being shoved into silence now turned toward leadership, toward reform, toward legacy. The same man who was shoved, struck, and humiliated now holds the authority to reform the skies. The man, once seen as a passenger, had become the architect of the air. The gavel came down hard. The federal judge's voice echoed through the silent courtroom, clear and final. 8 years in federal prison, no parole. Farron Doss didn't flinch, not visibly, but the color drained from his face as the weight of that sentence finally anchored in. He had entered the courtroom still believing he could spin his actions, still thinking a uniform and a badge of protocol could shield him. But now, seated between two stone-faced marshals, hands cuffed and eyes dull, he looked more like a shadow than a man. It wasn't just the sentence that stunned the room, it was the revelation that followed. As the prosecutor approached the bench with a sealed folder, murmurs spread. "Your Honor," he said, "we respectfully enter into record that Mr. Doss ignored not one, but 2 flagged alerts on passenger Varrin's manifest, each marked Level 7 clearance moments before initiating the confrontation." Gasps rippled across the room. Even reporters worn down by weeks of coverage jolted forward in their seats. Meanwhile, miles away, Dr. Marlon Varrin stood quietly at the edge of his own driveway. He had just returned home with his son, Leron, bundled in a soft gray wrap, asleep against his chest. The neighborhood, usually quiet, had gathered, not to gawk, but to welcome. His neighbors, some holding back tears, others carrying small gifts or signs of support, waited not with pity, but with respect. A middle-aged man from 2 doors down approached first, pressing a hand to Marlon's shoulder. "You didn't just protect your child," he said, voice cracking. "You protected all of ours." Marlon offered a nod, tired but gracious. He was still in pain, his ribs bruised, wrist stiff, and a headache that hadn't let up since landing, but none of it compared to the emotional heaviness that lingered. Not from the assault, but from the possibility that, had the encrypted case been damaged further, the very program meant to safeguard national infrastructure could have been compromised. Inside the house, on the kitchen counter, sat the drawing. A child from the neighborhood, a boy named Davin, had given it to him as soon as he stepped out of the government van. In crayon strokes, the picture showed Marlon holding Leron, both surrounded by a glowing red shield. The initials LI, for the Leron Initiative, were scribbled beneath it. That drawing would become something more. The following week, the image was adopted as the official logo of the Leron Initiative. A father and son under a shield, symbolizing dignity under pressure and protection under threat. The program, now federal law, aimed to oversee in-flight behavior, crew misconduct, and create national safeguards for passengers with protected or sensitive clearance. But for Marlon, the logo was not a badge of victory. It was a promise, one he wasn't finished keeping. Despite the praise, the accolades, and even invitations to appear on national television, Marlon declined all. Instead, he turned to something quieter, more personal, and perhaps more powerful. He began recording a video series. The first episode of Beneath the Cabin Lights was filmed in his study, Leron cooing softly in the background. Marlon spoke directly into the lens, not as a strategist or public figure, but as a father. "Most people never see what happens behind the curtain of calm on a flight," he began. Most people never think it could happen to them, until it does. He didn't mention Varrin by name. He didn't have to. His restraint, his poise, his words, because my son was watching, had already shaped the national conversation. The episode gained traction overnight. Aviation groups, civil rights organizations, and training institutions began requesting permission to use the series in workshops. Airline executives, once silent, now issued open apologies. Retraining programs were overhauled, not just to focus on compliance or corporate liability, but on human empathy, emotional regulation, and ethical conduct under pressure. Marlon kept the series going, releasing an episode every week, each one a glimpse into moments passengers rarely saw, decision points where calm could break, where bias could bloom, and where dignity could be defended. He interviewed whistleblowers, crew members who had seen misconduct and stayed silent, and federal agents who had rushed to intercept Flight 917 when the distress signal was triggered. Each episode ended with the same quiet message. The skies are not neutral. They reflect what we allow to rise. Back at Aerolux Flight Services, the boardroom lights stayed on late into the night. The $480 million fine had gutted their budget. Contracts with federal agencies had been severed. Investors pulled out. And, worst of all, 10 of their top executives had resigned in a single week. One memo from the internal review leaked to the press. This was not one man's failure. It was our culture's refusal to confront him. Yet the public wasn't asking for Aerolux's destruction. They were demanding its transformation. And Marlon knew that reform wasn't about punishment alone. It was about vision. A vision that stretched beyond what had happened to him. Because for every man like him, carrying a briefcase of national secrets, there were thousands of others carrying only their humanity, often met with the same disrespect. He would fight for them, too. In a moment of quiet reflection, Marlon watched Leron sleeping in his crib, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. The soft light from the baby monitor cast a faint red glow, the same hue as the blinking wristband that had once triggered a national response. The irony wasn't lost on him. A color, once meant for silent distress, now symbolized something enduring. Justice. Not explosive, not loud, but constant, watchful. As he looked down at his own hands, still healing, still steady, he whispered to himself, "This isn't over. Not yet." He turned back to his desk, adjusted the microphone, and prepared to record the next chapter. Justice wasn't just handed down, it was lifted up, in the arms of a father who refused to drop his son. The camera flash clicked once, then silence. A photo appeared on the projection screen in the dark paneled briefing room. It wasn't a chart. It wasn't data. It wasn't a security graph. It was a single image. Marlon Varrin, slouched against a worn cabin seat, blood on his cheek, his 6-month-old son, Leron, asleep against his chest, swaddled in a crumpled blanket. "This is why," Marlon said quietly. The room fell still. Global airline CEOs, union leaders, legal observers, and federal regulators sat in frozen silence. Marlon stood at the head of the polished table, his hands folded calmly, his eyes scanning every corner of the room, not to intimidate, but to remind. The overhead lights buzzed faintly as the projector's hum filled the gap where words failed. No one moved. "Before we begin the technical rollout of the Shield Line protocol," he continued, "you need to understand that it didn't begin as a system. It began with a child, mine, and an assault that could have cost lives, not just dignity." He tapped a control key. A new slide appeared. This time it was the schematic of the Shield Line alert chain. Biometric stress tags, real-time flight crew audio routing, live behavioral markers, and a legal override signal routed to federal monitors if thresholds were triggered mid-air. Behind it all, a new protocol. Federal-grade oversight for mid-flight abuse and racial targeting, with criminal liability for violations. Outside the window, clouds drifted lazily over the Capitol. But inside the room, The atmosphere was thick with reckoning. Most of those seated knew why they were here. All of them had seen the footage. Some had tried to discredit it early on. That phase had passed. What remained now was consequence. Marlon leaned forward, his tone still controlled, though sharper. 3 attempted abuses have been prevented since pilot rollout. 3. And in each, the alert triggered just before it got physical. This is working. A hand raised. CEO of Veltran Air, Darren Callan, cleared his throat. Dr. Varrin, with all due respect, what about false positives? One bad biometric spike and our crew is flagged federally? Marlon didn't blink. Would you prefer one more child be bruised before you act? False positives don't choke fathers in galley corridors. Darren sat back, embarrassed. The point landed harder than he expected. Across the table, a younger airline executive, Ryden Harvis, spoke up. You said earlier that empathy isn't enough, that you're focusing on psychological roots. What did you mean? Marlon paused, then reached into the folder beside him. He withdrew a worn sheet of lined paper. It was a letter, slightly creased, the ink smudged in places. Farron Doss, the man who attacked me. He sent this from prison. He unfolded it slowly, holding it up like evidence. He wrote, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was trying to feel powerful. Marlon's voice didn't rise. Not protocol, not miscommunication. Power. That's the thread we must unravel, not just the act, but the desire behind it. Another silence. The image on the screen lingered. A father with a sleeping child, a red fingerprint bruise across his jaw. One executive quietly took out a pen and jotted notes without being asked. I'm not here to punish, Marlon said, walking slowly around the room. But we must study this, not to vilify, to understand, to prevent the next assault by understanding why the last one happened. He handed the letter to a staff member, who placed it on the table between 2 airline training directors. They looked at it like it was radioactive. Later, as the meeting ended and the Shield Line protocol was formally adopted across 5 major carriers, the photo remained on screen, untouched, unexplained. It was no longer data. It was evidence. Because preventing the next assault begins with understanding why the last one happened. Dr. Marlon Varrin stepped onto the tarmac of Valden City under a pale, rising sun, his grip steady around the small hand of his son, Leron, who now walked with careful, curious steps beside him. There were no reporters, no banners, no officials waiting with microphones this time, just the silence of the runway, the soft gusts of wind, and the distant whine of jet engines warming in the hangars. But this moment was not for applause. It was for remembrance. Just ahead, a newly painted aircraft rolled from a towering hangar, its silver hull gleaming against the morning sky. The words along its side were stenciled in bold, quiet power. Varrin 1, the integrity carrier. Marlon paused mid-step. The sight of it struck something deep in his chest. Not pride, not triumph, but a memory. The bulkhead, the shove, the crack of his glasses, Leron crying against his shoulder, the encrypted case kicked aside like garbage, and then, the silence that followed the slap heard across a nation. His fingers tightened instinctively around Leron's, who looked up with wide, alert eyes. The doors of the aircraft hissed open with hydraulic precision. A young black flight attendant descended the ramp slowly, his uniform crisp, his stride measured. He held a tablet in one hand, and a small badge glinted from his chest. Shield Line Certified Crew. Tier 1. His eyes locked onto Marlon with quiet reverence. Sir, the attendant said, stopping a few steps away. Your seat is ready, 1A. Marlon nodded, his expression unreadable. His steps didn't change, but inside him, a debate flickered. He looked past the aircraft, past the runway, as if searching for something far beyond. Then he turned, deliberately. Behind them, a slow-moving man approached. His walk was heavy, uncertain, elderly, gray suit, cane in one hand, trembling slightly as he moved forward, clutching a boarding pass with fingers that had known decades of wait. Marlon glanced at the ticket in his own hand, its embossed number catching the light. 1A. Then he looked at the old man. Without ceremony, he extended the ticket. "Today's your turn," Marlon said quietly. The elderly man blinked in surprise, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. Marlon simply smiled, gave a respectful nod, and stepped aside. The attendant didn't question it. Instead, he guided the stunned man forward, gently placing a hand on his back, helping him toward the stairs. Marlon watched for a moment longer before turning back toward the edge of the runway. Leron's tiny legs stumbled over a groove in the pavement, and Marlon steadied him with one hand. They continued walking, away from the plane that bore his name, away from the symbols, the seals, the power. A few minutes passed, just sky and silence. Then Leron tugged at his father's hand and asked, "Why do they know your name now?" Marlon didn't answer immediately. He slowed his steps, knelt beside his son, and looked him in the eye. Behind them, the aircraft engines hummed softly, the world preparing to lift off once again. He smiled, a tired but peaceful smile. Because once, they tried to forget it. And as the father and son walked on, the camera panned upward, where two jet contrails crossed like quiet brushstrokes in the sky, forming a perfect X above the clouds. In that final moment, everything that was once broken now feels airbound again. And above the clouds, no one could erase the legacy of the man who never let go. Seconds later, presidential security stormed the aisle, freezing the entire crew in place. The attendants' arrogance evaporated. The airline went silent, and consequences fell faster than any strike he dared to deliver. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, strength, and unstoppable justice, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of vigilance and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.